The sky over Cressy went dark in August of 1346, and it was not from rain. It was arrows, thousands of them, falling in a single minute, coming down on French knights in polished steel who rode into that storm and never rode out of it. Horses screamed and rolled. Men drowned in mud under the weight of their own armor. By nightfall, over 1,000 noblemen of France lay dead on that slope, and Edward III had won the most complete victory an English king had ever won. But there is something almost nobody tells you about that day. To win it, Edward had emptied his own kingdom. Every trained soldier, every knight, every warhorse, every man who knew how to hold a line was standing in that French field, 400 miles from home. Behind them, England lay wide open. No army, no king. Nothing but harvest fields and church bells. And 200 miles north of London, a young man was already reading a letter about it. What happened over the next 8 weeks ended with a king on his knees in a shallow river, an arrowhead buried in his skull, and 11 years of his life erased. And it is not the king you are thinking of. It gets stranger. He was not brought down by a duke or a marshal or a champion in painted armor. He was brought down by farmers, by blacksmiths, by parish priests holding weapons they had never trained with. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are walking through one of the most underestimated campaigns of the 100 Years' War. How a treaty signed 50 years earlier forced Scotland to invade an England with nobody left to defend it. What the Longbow actually did on that field that history keeps getting wrong, and why the cost of that one afternoon was still being paid by Scottish villages 3 generations later. Stay with me, because the ending is not the one the chronicles advertise. That letter came from Philippe VI of France, and it was not a request between friends. It was an invoice. 50 years earlier, in 1295, Scotland and France had signed something later generations would romanticize as the Auld Alliance, the Old Alliance, a bond of eternal friendship. Strip away the poetry, and it was survival arithmetic. 2 weaker kingdoms with one dangerous neighbor wedged between them, agreeing that England could never be allowed to fight only one of them at a time. The clause that mattered was brutally simple. If England attacked France, Scotland attacked England. No debate, no exceptions. It was less a treaty than a trigger, and Scotland was pulling that trigger from a position it could not survive twice. Roughly 1 million people against an England of 4 to 5 million. Scotland could never win on weight, so it had learned to win on timing, striking only when England looked away. In the autumn of 1346, England was not looking away. England was gone. Which brings us to the man holding the letter. David II was crowned at 5 years old. At 7, with his kingdom collapsing, he was shipped to France and spent the next 7 years living under Philippe's protection.
You have been with us long enough, David.
A boy king in borrowed rooms in a borrowed country. He came home at 17, owing France something no treaty could measure. He owed them his childhood. So understand what this decision actually was. This was not a strategist reading a map. This was a debtor answering a debt, and a son standing in the shadow of a father the whole world still worshipped. Robert the Bruce, the man who beat the English at Bannockburn. Every Scot alive compared them, and David knew it. The cruelest wars in history rarely begin with greed. They begin with a man who needs to prove he deserves his own name. He was warned. By the very men who had fought beside his father, we will come back to that warning. In early October of 1346, David crossed the border with roughly 12,000 men, and almost immediately ran into the problem that governed every medieval campaign ever fought. Armies of that era carried no supply chain. There were no depots, no wagon trains stretching back to Edinburgh, nothing. An army ate the ground it stood on. 12,000 men plus horses could strip a district bare in a single day, which meant the army could never stop moving, and could never move fast either.
Get that cart clear
Because
now.
here is
Move
what
the cattle
slowed
off the
them
road we
down.
march on.
And it was not the hills. It was the looting. Plunder was not a moral failure of the Scottish army. Plunder was the supply system. Every barn opened, every granary emptied, every herd driven off was the difference between marching and starving.
Guide the sheep down the road, quickly.
So they burned their way south.
Keep
Lanercost
marching, steady
Priory,
pace. We
Hexham
move
Abbey. Stone houses of God that had stood for centuries, gutted in an afternoon. Church bells were pulled from their towers and melted down because bronze was worth more than prayer. For weeks, the wind off the Pennines carried the smell of wet smoke. And this is where it turns. Their looting worked too well, and that is precisely what killed them. Every hour spent stripping a village was an hour not spent marching. Worse, every burning roof threw a column of smoke into a clear October sky, visible for 20 miles. David thought he was moving through an empty country. He was actually drawing a map of his own position across the entire north of England, in smoke, for anyone with eyes. He believed the North had no army. About the professional soldiers, he was completely right. About everything else, he was catastrophically wrong. Which brings us back to that warning. The old lords who had fought beside his father told him plainly, never underestimate the English when they have no king. They fight best when nobody is telling them what to do. 30 miles away, in Durham, one man was already proving it, and nobody had ordered him to. His name was Ralph Neville, and he held no royal command, no commission from Edward, no orders from London. He was simply a northern lord who looked at the smoke on the horizon and decided that somebody had to do something, so it might as well be him. What he assembled was not an army. Let that land properly. The force that met the Scots was priests and blacksmiths, farmers pulled off the harvest, wool merchants and cart drivers from York and Durham, men whose hands knew tools and not weapons. The Archbishop of York rode out and preached recruitment from the pulpit, turning parish churches into muster points. 6,000 to 7,000 of them answered, against 12,000 Scots. Half the number, and almost none of them soldiers. So Neville did the only intelligent thing available to him. He refused to fight on open ground. He chose a ridge west of Durham, land cut apart by ditches, hedgerows, and dry stone walls, and he waited there. That terrain was the entire battle. The Scottish Schiltron, that dense hedgehog of spears that had shattered English knights at Bannockburn, only works if the formation stays perfectly intact. Neville picked ground where staying intact was physically impossible. Then the longbows opened. And here is what most people get wrong about them. English longbows did not slaughter armies. Against decent armor, most arrows wounded rather than killed. What the longbow actually did was worse. It made standing still unbearable. A formation that holds its ground survives. Under arrow fire, men flinch, they crowd, they push forward just to end it. The longbow did not break the Scots. It made the Scots break themselves. They advanced into the ditches and the walls, and the spear wall came apart exactly as the ground demanded. After that, it was not a battle. It was thousands of men, pressed together at arm's length, and the sound was not war cries. It was wood hitting wood, iron scraping iron, and the heavy, ragged breathing of men too exhausted to shout. Farmers with wooden staves decided the fate of a crowned king that afternoon. David II did not die on that field. What happened to him was far more humiliating than dying. He was found hiding under a bridge in the water, alone. The man who found him was John Copeland, a minor English knight with no title worth remembering. And David did not surrender quietly. He swung at Copeland and knocked the man's teeth out, which is remarkable for a king who had already taken 2 arrows to the face. Surgeons dug one head out. The second stayed lodged in his skull for the rest of his life. A piece of English iron he carried inside him for another 25 years. That is the king who lost 11 years of his freedom. Not Edward. David. 11 years in English custody, while his kingdom governed itself without him. And then came the bill. 100,000 marks in ransom, a sum larger than several years of Scotland's entire national income.
I will not shame Scotland this
Scotland
day.
could not pay it.
You must not cross the Tweed, Your
Scotland
Grace.
paid
It
it
is suicide.
anyway,
Our forces are not
in
assembled.
installments,
Wait for support.
across
Do not throw away your
generations,
life for pride, boy.
through taxes squeezed out of villages that had never seen Paris, never met Philippe, and had no say whatsoever in a promise signed in 1295. The Old Alliance has been celebrated for 700 years as a symbol of friendship between two proud nations. At Neville's cross, it had a price tag, and the invoice went to Scottish farmers, not to France. So it is fair to ask the uncomfortable question, who does an alliance actually serve? The nation
Clear now.
or the king who signs it?
March on.
History carves the names of kings into stone. They leave names on monuments.
Hurry it up, men.
But on a
Get that
ridge
grain loaded
outside
now.
Durham in October of 1346, a kingdom was saved by blacksmiths, harvesters, and parish priests
Fill these
whose
sacks and
names
bring them to the
appear
wagon.
in no chronicle,
Guide the sheep
on
down
no
the road,
monument,
quickly.
in no history anyone teaches.
Keep marching. Steady
They
pace.
stopped an
We move
invasion,
south.
captured a king, and vanished completely. Maybe that says something about how history actually gets made. Or maybe it just says something about who gets remembered.